So anyway, everybody, thank you very much for being here, and Martha, thanks for organizing it. So I'll speak briefly about issues of anti-Semitism and what we call the war against the Jewish people in higher education. So very briefly, in our work, so at ISGAP, we have this postdoctoral training program here at the Woolf Institute. We have postdocs now at McMaster University in Ontario, at NYU, and at UPenn. We also now recently established a program at INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies, and we're doing two projects there with a group of scholars, one on Israeli-American relations, the future of American-Israeli strategic relations, and the impact of the Muslim Brotherhood and Qatar on democratic principles. So, and basically, we're doing various research projects. We have faculty now. We have about 5 faculty members, and we have research fellows from around the world. We're up to about 80 research fellows. It's a vibrant center. We have a digital research center where we do programming, seminars, conferences, and symposiums online. And this semester, I'm happy to say, we're doing seminar series in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. So we're trying to really be global and really be inclusive and bringing people from different perspectives sort of into the space. We also find in the study of contemporary anti-Semitism, there's sort of a gap between discourse and knowledge in various languages. So we're trying to bridge the gap and bring scholars who are working in the French environment or Spanish environment and the English environment together, and also to try to include people who are in the Arabic space, dealing with issues that are very much connected to the study and combating contemporary anti-Semitism, because there are wonderful scholars and policymakers in the Arabic space also fighting radicalization, the Muslim Brotherhood and its ideology, the Iranian revolutionary regime and the threat it poses to the region, not just to the Jewish people, but to the region, and how anti-Semitism is often a way to distract and appeal to the uglier side of humanity for all sorts of reasons. So it's we're expanding, and it's I guess unfortunately it's an important topic these days. So we have various research projects, and we're also dealing with indigenous issues. We have a program called Jewish Consciousness that comes out of the Black Consciousness movement, which I was active in as a kid. You know, one of my mentors and professors was somebody who was one of the creators of the Black Consciousness movement in Southern Africa. And the Black Consciousness movement was a way, in a sense, that, you know, I guess European racist identities, white people were superior, black people were inferior. Blackness takes away a lot of people's wisdoms and culture, sort of makes them into unidimensional objects. So in a way, the Black Consciousness movement not only tried to flip the paradigm, but actually went into African culture and wisdom and its connection to the land and cosmology as a way to resist the framework that was being imposed upon them to combat the apartheid system. And in Jewish consciousness, we're trying to, in a way, empower particularly young Jewish people, students, and even faculty members who are increasingly under attack for being Jewish, for being Zionist, for being fascist and apartheid supporters, and supporting the apartheid genocidal regime. And in a sense, identities are being imposed once again in a very vicious way upon Jews. And I think Jewish consciousness is a way, I think, to really empower young people to connect to their wisdom and in a way to sort of combat anti-Semitism. So it's rather incredible if you think about it, and I'll talk about the different phases of anti-Semitism very briefly before I go into the research project that we're going to deal with here. But if you think about it, the academy, the universities, the greatest scientists, professors of eugenics and biology, theologians, social scientists, really in the early 1900s defined the Jew as not white, as a racialized group that was poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race and had to be eliminated. It was racist anti-Semitism that culminates in the Holocaust. But the incredible thing is that the best universities, the best thinkers of the time, defined the Jew as the other, defined the Jew as a racialized group, and that in those days, the notion that race was something that was innate. You couldn't escape your racial identity. It was not only in our character, but it was innate in our essence. So you can speak languages, you can practice the best music, you can master the philosophy and theology of the land and of the culture, but you were still racialized in a certain way. So this racist identity was really driven in large part by the intellectuals, by the best intellectuals. And now fast forward less than two generations later, the best intellectuals in Oxbridge and the Ivy Leagues and the Sorbonnes of the world are now defining the Jews as white. And it's not white, welcome to the club and we're so sorry for what happened to you. It's white, and now we've become the embodiment of all that was the essence of this civilization, of this culture. So now the Jew has become white supremacist, racist, settlers, apartheid supporters, genocidal, and the list goes on. And this obviously is not just the defining of the Israeli context, because I think a lot of people in the West and in Jewish communities in Europe and North America were thinking that this was a problem for the Israelis. And if only the Israelis and the Palestinians could work it out, everything would be okay. But slowly, I remember going to Shabbats in Paris in the 1980s and the 1990s, and suddenly there were paramilitary police defending the synagogues on Shabbat, right? And slowly, this sort of like a cancer, this disease of anti-Semitism, and defining the Jew as white, as a Zionist, as a settler, has now permeated European society and North American society, and it started in the classroom 40, 50 years ago, from the classroom to the encampments to our streets. And we know, and this is what I'll talk about, follow the money, is that the enemies of democracy know full well that if you want to influence society, if you want to influence democratic societies, perhaps the most sensitive, the most important institution in our democracy is higher education. This is where young people go to learn to be citizens. This is where they learn their values, right? Influence, hijack, change the discourse in higher education, you influence society. This is where young future professors go. This is where young journalists in the media of record go, particularly at the elite universities. Captains of industry. This is where the leaders of society go. And if you inculcate them with hate, it will have an impact on society. So this is sort of what we're doing in ISGAP, and I'll explain the project that I'll speak to you about. But I'll just say very briefly, I'll give you the history of anti-Semitism in 90 seconds, so forgive me. It's a much more complicated, nuanced legacy than what I'm going to do in a few seconds, so forgive me. But I would argue that there's three basic phases or main phases of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitisms. One was the Christian religious phase, where the Jew was perceived as blinded by evil, blinded by darkness, because they were unwilling and incapable of accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah. And if you don't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah, based on Christian teachings throughout many centuries and various kinds, and there's experts here on theology, so, forgive my crude, broad strokes, because I know there's nuances in this and even contradictions in what I'm going to say, but in general, there was this hatred for the Jew for not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah. And what makes anti-Semitism inherently genocidal, unlike the other forms of hatreds, which is, has caused so much devastation and suffering and violence, historically, racism, sexism, other forms of discrimination. What I think distinguishes anti-Semitism from other forms of hatred is its inherent genocidal component. Because there was this belief that if the Jew doesn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah, that they cannot have redemption, but what made it genocidal is that the Jew was holding back the redemption of the world. They were holding back the coming of a messianic age. So the Jews were forcibly converted, driven out, exiled, pogroms, etc. You know the history well. When I think the dominant gaze shifted, certainly in the West, from religious notions, a dominant notion or worldview, to notions of race and ethnicity and biology and nationalism, the Jew living in various communities throughout Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, suddenly became others to the indigenous national group. So this ushered in a period of sort of racist anti-Semitism, which I touched on earlier, which culminates in the Holocaust, I would argue. And unlike the Christian form of anti-Semitism, where the Jew had somewhat of an escape hatch, they could convert or even sometimes run away. In the racist form of anti-Semitism, there was no escape. So people like von Herder and all the great Enlightenment philosophers see race as something that is deeply rooted, and you can't escape this fate of your racialized, I won't even say identity, but an innate nature. There's no escape. And this culminates in the Holocaust. And as my colleague David Patterson has documented in his work, the rational project to eliminate the Jew from the face of the earth, even went so far where Nazis were sending battalions of troops because there were rumors there were 12 Jewish people near the North Pole. And they had to save humanity from the Jew and eliminate every single Jew in the world. This was the final solution project. So today, particularly in these spaces of Enlightenment thought in the university in the 2025, this sort of Christian racist forms of anti-Semitism are really, I'd say, frowned upon. But I would say they were deeply rooted, but at least at some level, not tolerated. I think if a scholar engaged in racist anti-Semitism or Christian nationalist anti-Semitism, they'd be in trouble, maybe they'd be fired, they'd be socially ostracized. It would be not such a good thing for them. But attack the Jew for who they are as a people, I would say, and in the words of David Patterson, it becomes at this moment not only acceptable, not only tolerated, but it becomes a moral requirement to define Jewish peoplehood in a certain way. So now the cause of the problems, the cause of world chaos, is the stubborn Jewish connection to the land, Zionism. And the Jewish connection to the land is now once again being defined as fictitious, problematic, etc. And I think if we speak about indigenous cultures, one can make an argument. If you look at the Torah, if you look at the Quran, if you look at the New Testament, if you look at history books, there is a presence of the Jewish people to the land, right? I remember traveling with my dear friend who will be with me. I'm meeting with him in Jerusalem tomorrow, Peter Peneshwe, who's the indigenous, the leader, the chief, the grand chief of the Innu people of northern Labrador, what is called Labrador today. And he was the head of the Assembly of First Nations of Canada. And I toured with him I spent 6 weeks with him in Sheshatshiu, learning about indigenous cultures. I was brought up in Montreal in a city, and I went up to Sheshatshiu, and I was hunting and gathering with Innu people. Kind of blew my mind that this incredible culture and language and way of life still existed in Canada, which I had no clue about as a 20-odd-year-old kid going there. And I went with him. He came with me to Israel. And we toured Israel, and looking at Israel from an indigenous perspective was, for him and I, extraordinary. And the holidays, the connection to the land, the four holy cities of Israel, representing the four elements of earth, wind, fire, and water, right? Hebron, Jerusalem, Tzfat, and Tiberias. The holidays, the connection, the shifting of seasons, as connected to the Torah, the oral and written Torah, extraordinary. So there is a deep tie to the land. And when Jews express it, particularly in the spaces, it's becoming increasingly difficult. And I think after October the 7th, at sort of an intellectual level and at a social level, the discourse has been shifting over the last few decades when it comes to Israel, Zionism, and the Jewish connection to the land. But after October the 7th, on October the 9th, it was a Monday morning, at universities around the West, there was this explosion, coordinated explosion of anti-Semitism. So how does this happen? So one of the projects that we're doing at ISGAP is called Follow the Money. And Follow the Money is looking at how the Muslim Brotherhood is funding universities in the West. And I think many of you know that the Muslim Brotherhood, I would argue, is a reactionary social movement that begins roughly 100 years ago in Egypt, and it basically is a fusion, I would call it a perversion of Islam, a very narrow understanding of Islam, with sort of a fusion of European anti-Semitism, genocidal anti-Semitism, and even Nazism and fascism, so European nationalism and fascism. And if you look at the Hamas charter, if I was the professor responsible for the people who wrote the Hamas charter, I would kick them out of the institution or the university for plagiarism. They literally take the protocols of the Elders of Zion. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, as many of you know, are basically this forged fake documents that define the Jewish people and Judaism as sort of this secret cabal that the Jews were trying to have all these conspiracies to usurp European Christian society. And the protocols of the Elders of Zion played a very important role in marginalizing Jewish people from Europe and justifying their removal from spaces of work, their removal from universities, going back to universities. The only institution in Germany and Austria to voluntarily give up the Jews were the universities, not the police forces, not the armies, not the unions, the universities. Interesting. So this led to the removal of Jews, putting them into ghettos and into the final solution. So here you have the Muslim Brotherhood in the name as a sort of a movement that grows out of their opposition to British colonialism. They adopt some of the most pernicious forms of hatred coming out of Europe, coming out of Britain, and the like, and adopting this narrow view of Islam to remove anything that's foreign from what will be the new caliphate, new Islamic space. So, and we have colleagues here who are experts on Charlotte is an expert on the Brotherhood. I work with amazing experts on these issues. I'm more focusing on the anti-Semitism of the Brotherhood historically and its ideology and its connection to Nazism and fascism. But what's also interesting, apropos, is Follow the Money. In ISGAP, in 2012, I stumbled into this issue. I discovered by mistake about $1.23 million that went to Yale University, where I was created and headed the first research center at a North American university ever dealing with anti-Semitism. And we were closed down, and it was decided that I was not appropriate to be its director, and my colleagues, senior professors and wonderful postdocs were not appropriate scholars, and we were closed down. There was no explanation given. The decision was deemed confidential. And as a footnote, 12 months before this happened, Yale approached me. They were so pleased with me, they were actually going to expand the institute. And in the United States, there's a special program where there's a few hundred scientists and gifted intellectuals who contribute to American society. They're given a fast-track green card. And because I wasn't American at the time, and Yale came to me and offered me this opportunity to have a green card, and they applied on my behalf to the State Department, and I received the green card, and now I'm an American citizen. But 12 months after this, our whole center was closed down, which was very odd, with no explanation. I was offered a job at Stanford. I went off to Stanford, and I mistakenly came across this email. It's a long story. I won't bore you with it, but I discovered this large gift that went to Yale from the Ben Mahfouz family, a Saudi businessman who's a known terror financer. He was funding and providing resources to terrorists. The Clinton administration blew up one of their chemical factories in the Sudan during the Clinton administration. Sort of a very well-known financer and bad actor gave this money to Yale, and it put me into being the researcher. This world of foreign funding in American universities is not my area of expertise. I was doing more social theory and ideology and philosophy. But I went down this rabbit hole and I started finding connections between banks and associations and foundations and professors and development people with really bad actors from the Middle East. And I thought, well, either I'm stumbled into a tip of an iceberg, or I'm just completely off the wall and it's just wrong. But I gave my initial findings to experts on issues of radical Islam and terrorism. I gave it to 3 prominent professors, and they were like, yes, we know this family, and we know this bank, and so I had stumbled onto a tip of an iceberg. And I spent the next 7 years with my mother and father's neighbor, who was a retired forensic accountant who became obsessed with this project, who just delved deep into these issues. And over 7 years with no budget, we found $3 billion of undocumented money going to American universities from the Muslim Brotherhood. In 2019, I presented our findings, in Washington. It was a summit on issues of anti-Semitism, and the head of, it's a long story how this was created, but I was knocking on doors for about a year, trying to get people to listen to what we had found. And finally, this meeting was set up, and I presented in front of the Secretary of Education. The Secretary of State was there, the Attorney General, the head of the FBI, head of Homeland Security. Basically, the top 100 civil servants were in this room, and we presented our work. The federal government then launched an investigation into illegal funding of American universities by foreign entities. In less than 6 months, they found $18 billion in undocumented money coming to universities. And when the Biden administration was elected, one of the first things that they did was called off the investigation. And I believe they called off the investigation not because of anti-Semitism or they were pro-radical Islam or whatever, or anything like that. But in the United States, the university has a very powerful lobby. Higher education is a tremendous industry worth trillions of dollars. And universities push for policies in Washington, and they want the free flow of money and people and students and scholars to go around the world, unregulated by the government. So I think that's their agenda, which, I guess if you're heads of universities, it makes sense. So the investigation was called off, but quite a bit of information came out of the investigation, and because of our little success at ISGAP, people started funding this program, and we've been able to really grow this research project into something pretty amazing. If I think back to that night sitting in Palo Alto, and I came across this email from one of the vice presidents of Yale, and it sort of led me down into this rabbit hole. It's 14 years later, it's a long time. ISGAP has an incredible team of researchers. Charlotte is one. We have a group of experts on radical Islam, political Islam, not to be confused with Islam at all, and I'm sure everybody around the table understands that. So experts on radical Islam, its ideology, issues of terror, financing, or the agenda, the ideology of radical Islamic groups and entities. We have a group of scholars that are really expert on anti-Semitism and understand higher education very well. And we're also working with an incredible group of forensic accountants and terror finance experts, people who are really accomplished in their field. Some of them are analysts, some of them are professors in the field. And we have about 22, 23 scholars and experts now working on this project. And after October the 7th, we really went, or it's not only October the 7th, but October the 9th, when this explosion of anti-Semitism really took place, mainly in higher education around the Western world. So since then, we've come out with 14 reports on various aspects of this issue, and there's more in the pipeline, and Charlotte will speak to the one that's coming out on Oxford in the next few weeks. So our focus has been on higher education in the United States, and now we're branching out into Canada and the United Kingdom. And in a way, one of our first reports was called The Network of Hate, which really looks at the ideology of radical Islamism and terror financing. And our forensic, so we have the experts on radical Islam and the terror finance experts, counterterrorism experts, kind of mapping out the space of influence. So we call it the network of hate. And we estimate that the Qataris and the Muslim Brotherhood has basically close to $1 trillion in assets that we've mapped. So as great as my scholars and colleagues are, if we've mapped $1 trillion, we assume there's significantly more. This is what we've documented. And they're basically using these dollars to use it as soft power. They're investing in universities, they're investing in the media, in other cultural institutions, sports franchises around the world, and they're losing money in many of these financial investments, but they're using it as soft power because they have so much resources, they're not really concerned about turning a profit when they fund BN TV, the sports channel here in Europe, or Al Jazeera. They're losing a lot of money, and their investments in universities often, consume money rather than produce outcomes. So they have $1 trillion, and we also trace the ideological connection of the Qatari regime to the Brotherhood. So basically, and I won't go into all the details because I want to kind of focus on more of the reports that we're doing, but essentially the royal family of Qatar has a bayah. A bayah in Hebrew means a problem, which may be an appropriate term, but in Islam, it's a spiritual oath. A bayah is a spiritual oath, and the royal family of Qatar has a spiritual oath, a bayah, to the Muslim Brotherhood. So, the Yusuf Kawadawi, for example, who was the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood until his passing a few, 3 years ago, preached his entire life that the true believer, the true Muslim, the authentic Muslim, is obligated to complete the work of Hitler. The true believer is obligated to complete the work of Hitler. This is Yusuf Kawadawi. This is the form of Islam that the Qatari royal family follows all of its religious edicts and fatwas. This is the ideology of the Qatari regime. Now, Qatar, as you know, particularly in the United States, by various governments, certainly by the Biden administration and previous administrations, and I suspect it's not going to radically change now. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think it will. The Qatari regime has Education City. They're investing in American universities. They have the most important American military base in the Middle East is in Qatar. There's tremendous investment and trade between the United States and other Western allies with Qatar. Qatar became the first Muslim country recently that has visa exemptions. You can basically come to the United States without a visa. For the first time, this has been offered to a Muslim country just a few months ago. So there's very close relations, and they're perceived in the media, which they have a tremendous amount of soft power and influence, as an honest broker, negotiator, the middleman between the radicals and the West, the radicals and even the Israelis. But I think it's very important to understand that this is the ideology of Qatar, deeply rooted in the Muslim Brotherhood. 40 years ago, the Swiss and American police discovered documentation that shows the strategic goals of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was called the Project. And in the Project, it shows ways in which the Muslim Brotherhood is going to take Israel and remove it from its alliances with the West, particularly the United States, to move it away from the West and the US, to isolate it and then to destroy it. Using the protocols of the Elders of Zion and all the mythology surrounding the Zionist entity to destroy Israel and to murder Jews around the world. But that's just the little Satan. The big Satan is going to be destroyed using anti-Semitism, because they understood that anti-Semitism was a way to weaken and fragment the United States and to weaken and fragment Europe. And they understood, particularly in Europe, that these ideas, these contemporary manifestations and ideologies surrounding the Jew and contemporary anti-Semitism would resonate, particularly in Europe, given the deep legacy, I would even argue foundational element of its civilization in Europe. So 40 years later, this was written more than 40 years ago, you know, we look around and there's this explosion of anti-Semitism. Israel has become, you know, the incarnation of, I don't know, just any word you can imagine. You know, it's anything in the garbage can, the garbage bin of history can apply to the Jew. Racist, extremist, fascist, genocidal, and apartheid. And one of our reports that came out on the South African connection to the ICJ case shows that the Qataris and the Iranians were helping the South Africans to bring their case to the International Court and basically bought the South African regime. And the Treasury Department called my colleagues and I in December to look at our report, and there's going to be, I think, quite a lot of interest in our what we uncovered between basically paying off the ANC, buying their brand, their really, you know, their illustrious special brand in terms of the human rights community as, you know, being anti-apartheid, and tarring the Israelis and the Jews and the Zionists as an apartheid regime. And we show the connections of Iran and Qatar and the PFLP in this process. So Qatar is a country of less than approximately 300,000 citizens, you know, Qataris. There's more people, expats living there, but there's 300,000 Qataris. They give more money than any other country in the world to American universities. So this tiny country of 300,000 people is investing more into American higher education than Canada, the United Kingdom, France, and many developed countries combined. So why are they doing this? You know, this is basically using soft power. In our research, and I won't go through all the reports, I'll be brief. So at Yale, we found several $1 million in undocumented money. Universities must report foreign gifts of more than $250,000, and they're not. We found $1.3 billion with a B that the Qatari regime gave to Texas A&M. Why Texas A&M? We think, we're not certain, but we think that that Texas A&M has one of 3 civilian nuclear research facilities. And we think this is one of the reasons why they targeted Texas A&M. We discovered their contract. All our research we do is legal and open source because we want to present it, you know, first of all, we want to be ethical, but we want to present it to governments for hopefully changing policy. And if there's any court cases, everything we find is legally obtained and documented and footnoted. All our reports have hundreds of footnotes and sources. We try to do high caliber research. We're not an advocacy organization or a research center. So we document everything. We found in the contract 502 research projects that Qatar has with Texas A&M in a very odd part of the contract, or basically all the contracts that we found between the Qataris and universities in the United States. Qatar owns the intellectual property rights for everything that is accomplished in the projects. We found 502 research projects. We flagged 58 of the projects as having dual use for military purposes and 13 for nuclear military research purposes. And we called on the federal government and the Department of Energy to do an investigation. We stand by our research. We hope we made mistakes. We hope our research is wrong. But I think this is a dire security issue, because as we know, the Qataris have very good relations with Iran, and Iran, everybody knows, is bent on getting nuclear weapons. And they have good relations with the Qataris. In fact, there's quite a few Iranian scholars and graduate students in Qatar. Qatar has this education city in Doha, has 8 American universities. UCL was there, but they closed down. The Sorbonne is still there, and there's 2 Canadian universities in Doha City. We did 2 reports on Texas A&M, and after our second report, Texas A&M decided in a confidential closed meeting to close their campus in Qatar, which I believe points to the fact that our research was accurate and that there's something is going on, and we're still calling for an investigation. And perhaps with this new administration, something will change, but a lot of people in the new administration has actually worked as consultants for the Qataris, so they pay a lot of people. At Cornell University, we found $10 billion, with a B, dollars that the Qataris gave to Cornell University. And, you know, the report, we stand by the report, nothing has happened. The federal government has done nothing, and Cornell has done nothing. So these type of, we've done a series of reports. We've done research on UPenn, MIT, Columbia, and we're finding all sorts of funds. We did 2 reports on Students for Justice in Palestine. SJP also comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. The AMP is connected to the SJP, which is part of the Muslim Brotherhood infrastructure. SJP has 400 chapters across North America, at North American universities in the United States and Canada. And basically, they're pushing on the ground anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic politics in campuses. And the incredible thing is, you know, I remember going to Jewish organizations in North America, to Hillel and other groups saying, you know, here's our report, read the report. And they didn't want to hear us. They were doing, you know, Shabbat dinners with SJP and student groups, trying to do rapprochement on campus, but not taking into consideration the ideology of SJP, which is unfortunate. But I think after October the 9th, with this explosion of anti-Semitism, Jewish student organizations in particular, because Jewish young people on campuses are experiencing anti-Semitism in ways that older people don't. And it's quite vicious. And there's studies coming out now, the ADL and other research centers, you know, looking at how many Jewish students and faculty on American campuses experience anti-Semitism. And the statistics are outrageous. You know, there's one study done by Barry Cosman, who was here in London for many years, and he did a study showing that I think African American students experience racism on campus. I believe it's like 26 or 27% of African American students have witnessed or experienced racism in the course of a year. Issues of sexism, women experiencing or witnessing sexism was slightly higher. I think it was like 29%. It's like 3 or 4 points higher. There's more sexism than racism. And Jewish students experiencing or witnessing anti-Semitism was over 80%, right? So, and survey after survey are basically, you know, in this range. So the vast majority of faculty and students are experiencing anti-Semitism today on campus. So that's SJP. I'll just end here and say we're coming out with a report on Oxford, which Charlotte will speak to. This is also part, you know, Charlotte's the lead on this, but this is also part of a group effort of forensic accountants and experts on the Brotherhood. The United Kingdom has been a significant hub of Muslim Brotherhood and radical Islam. I'm sure people around the table know this well. Yosef Kawadawi, the character who said that all true believers have to finish the work of Hitler. This is the character that started Islamic studies at Oxford University. This is the character that worked with Ken Livingstone and George Galloway and Corbyn and these characters and entered into Oxford, creating one of the most important research centers in the West, a massive research center, which is sort of independent but very much ensconced in Oxford. I did my doctorate there. I was a research fellow there in St. Anthony's College, where the Center for Middle East Studies is. Tariq Ramadan, the grandson of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, was a very respected scholar at St. Anthony's College. Even when he was sitting in prison for years awaiting trial and accused of all sorts of horrific, violent acts against sexual violations of women, he was still on their website and on their mantle for many years, despite even students, and this is, I know this personally from first-hand witnesses, many women at St. Anthony's College experiencing very uncomfortable moments with Professor Ramadan, and they were told basically to keep their mouths shut. But here we go. Because the power of the soft power in Oxford, in the Ivy Leagues, is profound and significant. So I think this is the Follow the Money project. So Oxford is very important because I think the British, on this kind of new wave of anti-Semitism, this new wave of the Red-Green Alliance was, I think, ahead of its time. The wave came into North America, I think, more recently, in the last couple of decades, and certainly explodes now in a way that's maybe even more dangerous than Europe, because in Europe, I think you still have strong government, and governments are trying to deal with anti-Semitism and radical Islam, and there's still state programs and apparatus in place. The United States is much more a free market society. I think the state is much weaker, and I think the dangers of really a radical shift in the United States, there isn't the guardrails. I worry about what's happening in the United States, and I think here it's a bit softer in some ways because of state intervention. So Charlotte will speak about Oxford, which is fascinating. We're doing a project that I think is really, for me, one of maybe the most exciting, is looking at Georgetown. And Georgetown, we have really Muslim Brotherhood intellectuals deeply ensconced in Georgetown for decades. Esposito and Brown and all of these guys, if you know them, really having an effect, training scholars, professors going out into the American university system, now into their second and third generation of Muslim Brotherhood-inspired scholars in the United States. The most important training program for diplomats in the United States, if not the world, is at Georgetown, very much connected to the Muslim Brotherhood funding and apparatus in Georgetown. So having an impact in policy in a very significant way. And then also, there's a group of American Muslim Brotherhood supporting businesses, very affluent business people and successful domestic corporations, funding Georgetown, funding all of these projects and programs legally in the United States because it's domestic funding, and also funding mosques and Muslim intellectual centers in the United States, kind of grooming and radicalizing the discourse. Canada, we're going to come out with a report shortly. So I think Georgetown is fascinating, and that will be a big report. Canada seems to be the middle place between the United Kingdom and the United States. It's a place where a lot of money is being laundered, and the Qataris and the Muslim Brotherhood they don't fund universities because the state funds universities more. It's more like the United Kingdom, less than the United States, which is more free market corporations offering university education. But they're funding mosques and community organizations and radicalizing students on campus, but it's more community-based funding. And I'll just end, and I'll be happy to take comments and questions, and feel free to ask tough, critical questions as well. But I just want to end by speaking about how in 1983, Edward Said said that he's the last remaining Jewish intellectual. and that, some people thought he had a bad day, but anyways, and that he was the sole inheritor to the Frankfurt School of Thought. The Frankfurt School of Thought, as I'm sure all of you know, is a very important philosophical movement that comes out of Europe during the Second World War and the Holocaust. Many of the key scholars were Jewish refugees, survivors, Adorno, Horkheimer, Hannah Arendt, and others, and that he was the last Jewish intellectual, the heir of this important philosophical movement, and that Jewish professors became fat scribes in the suburbs of America. So people thought he had a bad day. And he went on to say that the Palestinians were the Jews, and the Jews and the Israelis were the Nazis. So 1983, to say this, it was a bit disconnected from reality. But go into any Middle East studies program today. Go into many literary criticism schools and social philosophy schools and even now diplomacy schools. And this is a very important part of the zeitgeist of today's scholarship, right? So it's incredible that this happened. And this happens now also with a massive investment from the Brotherhood into our education system. And I'll end with one more thing. Emmanuel Levinas, who I'm a fan of, who basically brings Jewish thought and Jewish philosophy into academia, into the Western University. He's not just a Jewish scholar, but he's a scholar that brings Jewish thought into university. And he brings Pirkei Avot and the Talmud, and he famously writes how that when we see our face in the face of the other, when we see our face in the face of the other, this is the instant we become human. We need the other to be human. This is Jewish ethics. Everybody's created in the image of God. There's no criteria that you have to tick out, you have to say this or do that or think this or jump like this. Everybody's created in the image of God. And we need each other. We need the other to be a human. When we see ourselves in the face of the other, this is when we're human. It's not tolerance. It's not toleration. If I am sexist, I eliminate 51% of humanity's possibilities to be human. If I'm racist, I eliminate 1 billion possibilities to be a human being. I need the other. So with humility, we have to see the other. But Levinas also goes on to say that any social movement, any ideology, and we know Levinas comes out of, his family were murdered in the Holocaust in Lithuania. He survived because he was in France. He also teaches emphatically that any social movement, any ideology that does not see all human beings as human needs to be resisted. You don't negotiate, you don't compromise, you fight it. And this is an obligation. And here we have radical political Islam, who sees Jews emanating from the urine of donkeys and coming out of apes and pigs as being subhuman, and then put upon this the protocols of the Elders of Zion, taking European Nazi anti-Semitism as part of its worldview. From the perspective of Emmanuel Levinas, on the one hand, looking at the sanctity of life, looking at the necessity to see every human being in order to see our face in the face of the other, to be a human. So it's profound, right? It's profound ethic recognition with humility of the other. We need the other. And yet, he's also, I think, correctly arguing, any social movement that doesn't see the other as human, we have to resist. There's no compromise. Resist, to destroy it. And then, of course, here we are in academia, in the university environment, where Jews are being purged. Tenured professors at Ivy League universities in the United States of America in 2025 are being purged. I'm choosing my words carefully. Students are being physically attacked. Professors, I know some, cannot go to campus because they are being physically threatened. 2025, ladies and gentlemen. And yet, pathetically, many of our colleagues at these illustrious, wealthy, not just in funds, but wealthy in ideas, with a legacy of learning and education at the highest levels, are either supportive or acquiesce to this genocidal movement. And here we are. And yeah. it's a serious moment in the battle of ideas, and it's a serious moment in the world of policy, in the world of our our democracies. And Elie Wiesel, who I had the privilege of starting ISGAP with many years ago, always taught that anti-Semitism is not a parochial problem for the Jews or for Israel. That anti-Semitism will always begin with the Jews, but it never, ever, ever ends with the Jews. And this is really an assault on humanity and human decency, and certainly on democratic principles. And here we are. So it's a challenging time. It's really a privilege that ISGAP is here at the Woolf Institute in Cambridge, and we're trying to create a space in good universities where these ideas can be discussed and debated and written about at the highest levels of scholarship, and really fighting anti-Semitism in the battlefield of ideas, but not just writing reports that sit on some shelf or books that 3 or 4 people read in some dusty seminar room, but really to engage students and faculty and create high caliber scholarship to kind of map, decode, and fight anti-Semitism. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to have questions or comments. So thank you.
I have comments as well as questions.
So, thank you.
And I'll say the comments first, and then I'll answer the questions. 2 comments, one for the Woolf Institute. Woolf Institute, there are things that are done across the university that are subtle messages, that are subliminal, that tell people that it's okay to treat Jews differently. The Woolf Institute sent out the notice for this. It said, do you have any dietary requirements? Are you vegetarian, halal? There were a few others, but kosher was not included. Okay? I'm a member of St. Edmunds, and I have an issue with St. Edmunds because there was a recent program that was about tolerance and understanding among religions, and there was not a Jewish representative there to speak, so that you had an imam, there was a priest, there was a minister, there were other religious leaders, but there was no Jew present. And that sends a message to the students and to the universities. And I know there were faculty members here at the university that were very upset, Jewish faculty members, Jewish members of St. Edmunds, alumni as well, that were upset that a message is being sent out, tolerance and understanding are okay, but Jews are excluded. Not good. Question for you. Firstly, as an American and someone who's involved in the Jewish world in the United States, who's funding you? That's number one. Number two.
Not Qatar. But.
Second question is, the research report, as you said, these research reports incredibly important and significant. But how do we bring more people who are not Jewish into this discussion, make it important to them, so that this is a larger collective effort to change the world that we live in?
So thank you for your comments and your question. So who funds us? It's basically family foundations, private family foundations in the United States, mostly New York. And we have a good group of people. Yeah. And not Jewish scholars. So one of the best programs, first of all, many of our participants and scholars and presenters and students who attend our programs are not Jewish. We have, I think one of the best programs we do, we have a teacher training program at Oxford University on issues of anti-Semitism. It's a 2-week intensive training program where we help professors create courses on contemporary anti-Semitism studies. We're trying to get that into space. We have about 600 graduates over 10 years, and the majority of them are not Jewish, and many of our presenters are not Jewish. And I think scholars of this area understand that this is really an affront on human rights and democratic principles. And yeah, we have scholars from North America, Europe, South America, the Middle East. We had people from the UAE. With the Woolf Institute, we did a program in Saudi Arabia, and I've been back since, in North Africa. So we have 2 Muslim scholars are teaching an amazing course now on minority and women rights online. So we're international and deeply committed to those type of ideas. Yeah. Thanks. Daniel.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I think it's probably the most important topic, the topic of funding, of course, and foreign interests. For the sake of the understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood and impact, but also in the broader sense, there is a, and it's not new, there are a few attempts to influence the state of affairs in the West by various agents. And I think if you understand one, you have tools to understand others as well. The little addition, hopefully useful, that I would like to make to this conversation is to say, to highlight the need to understand the inherent interests within Western universities that predate any funding. And these interests converge with the funding, or can easily converge. And by this I mean, it's an area which I'm afraid I understand very well. Apart from being a statistician, I have a degree in Middle Eastern Studies. Departments for Middle Eastern Studies are departments that have, I'd say, inherent interests, not so much in dialogue between cultures or civilizations, but a very clearly, intuitively understood material and emotional, spiritual, intellectual interests in the societies they study. It's not necessarily that they derive salaries from what these societies or regimes give, but they need access to them, they need institutional visits, they need approval of the authorities to just be in contact with the societies that they study. And that very often, and it cannot be otherwise, determines ways in which they behave. This is also not particularly limited to Jews or issues of anti-Semitism. Richard Pipes, who was advisor to President Reagan on everything related to Soviets, it's in the 70s and the 80s we're talking about, described a very interesting dynamic in the Sovietologist community in the US at that time. If you think that all people who advised to Reagan were anti-communist, they were not. Most of them stood sort of sat on the fence in relation to the Soviet Union, or they pretended to sit on the fence. And when he described them with a very ferocious way, but there was also something that was almost forgiving in that description. How otherwise they would visit the Soviet Union, ever? How they would have access to the society that they actually need to study? This is not a YouTube society. How they would be having exposure firsthand to that language, like these books. So I'm not trying to say, not for political correct reasons, that there's a blemish in that community, but I think there's a risk factor. This is a risk factor, and it's not, I could say this about people who study China, knowing nothing about that, by the way. It's a risk factor because there's an inherent interest that can be clearly defined and humanly understood in these communities. That's
I agree. I'll just add one antidote. So when we were at Yale, we did a lot of work on radical Islamic ideology, and we did a big conference on Iran, and it became huge. We had, 50 speakers. It was 2 days at Yale, and then we did a big event at the Yale Club in New York, and we had Iranian dissidents and scholars from all over the world. It was a big event. And a few weeks after, the Iranians the regime came out with a list, and they put the BBC and different research centers in London, in Washington, and Yale on this list of hostile entities that were against the regime and were, CIA hubs and all this stuff. And Yale was on the list. So one of the heads of the university called me, and who was a friend, and he said, Yale put us, Yale was put on the list by the regime, and the president and people at the university are blaming me and the research center on anti-Semitism. They said it's because of us. And my reaction was, wow, that's amazing. The Iranian regime is listening to us. That means our message is getting out. This is good. And my friend said to me, Charles, you're so naive. You don't understand. At Yale, we believe in academic freedom. And the community has to be practicing academic freedom. If a member of the community interferes with the academic freedom of the other, this is a serious violation. So they accused me of doing exactly this. I was risking the fact that Iranian students can come to Yale, and that scholars of Iran, and there were big research projects in different departments at Yale of scholars and postdocs going to Iran to study. And that's so what happened is exactly right. I thought at first this is wonderful, and then I was told this is not so good. So yeah, you're right, Daniel.
It's easy to see the financial and ideological, especially financial, but also the ideological reasons why universities get involved with this money. What's your sense of why the federal government is so lax in policing this?
So it's a great question. So there are laws in the books that came out of there was a fear in the 1930s and 40s of a fear of Nazism spreading to the United States and then later communism. So there's these laws, federal laws that exist that any nonprofit organization and any university receiving foreign funding over $250,000 needs to report it to the Department of Education and the IRS. And the laws are there and they're quite detailed. They've been there for many years. But there's no enforcement of the law. And again, I think it goes to the lobby of the universities. They want to have a unregulated sector of the U.S. economy. They want to be left alone to do their work, to travel, to go, to get money. So they're pushing to keep the federal government away from interfering with higher education. And I think that's a very serious part of it. However, in the last 18 months or so, ISGAP, we've presented our work to over 150 congressional leaders and about 40 senators. We've been briefing various committees and subcommittees, and we've been testifying. And I think there's traction. Qatar is an issue in part because of our work, and we have an amazing PR team and strategic public relations advisor. So I'm sure many of you have heard about Qatar and foreign funding. It's sort of around now in the public discourse. That comes out of our work. It's interesting. For reasons which I don't necessarily agree with, and there's all sorts of contradictions in this, I think this new administration, for reasons which I don't necessarily like, I think they want to have more oversight in higher education. If, not only is there foreign funding laws, but also for under Title VI, the federal government can't fund or do business with any private or public entity which is discriminating against Americans based on race, gender, and religion. And clearly, Jewish students and faculty at many universities are being discriminated against.
Was your organization involved in the recent litigation at Harvard that they just settled yesterday, right?
Yeah, some of them settled,
Right.
and some are continuing. Yeah, I don't think it's a mistake that the day that the Trump administration came into power, that Harvard finally adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. So I think the universities understand that they're going to be under significant pressure now. And I know at Columbia, for example, the federal government gives at least $350 million a year in Title VI funding to Columbia. And there's just a lot of anti-Semitic instances and lawsuits. I think there's going to be a push to get the universities to stop this and to stop not just on the campus, not just the physical intimidation, but to really, I think, address the intellectual environment as well, which is justifying and legitimizing anti-Semitism. I hope. We'll see. But but this government is not. This new administration is, filled with contradictions and unpredictable. So let's see.
I'm curious. You spoke mostly of the funding going into research, or either starving Jewish studies or trying to support other initiatives. But funding directly going into anti-Israel rallies post October 7, is that something that you've also looked at?
Yeah, so SJP, we did 2 reports on Students for Justice in Palestine, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And they played a significant role. They're almost like the shock troops. You have the intellectuals, you have the research centers, you have the professors, legitimizing a certain discourse when it comes to Jewish peoplehood. And that becomes, avant-garde scholarship. And I think they're almost like the shock troops, they're making life difficult on the ground for students. So you have the intellectuals, and then you have the guys running now the encampments, but for years, really intimidating Jewish students on campus. And now, apropos of what this new administration may do, they just passed an executive order that anybody in the United States supporting a terror organization, if they're not American citizens or they're on a visa, they'll be deported. And we're actually having a big symposium in Washington in March. Our goal is to try and create policies or recommendations for policies that deal with the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States. I would like them to be banned. Many people say because of political freedom and freedom of speech, it's impossible to ban them, but maybe at least get the federal government to stop supporting organizations associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. So we're trying to come up with a policy on this. So I think with this administration, I was just reading about what they're doing with refugees. They're stopping refugees. It's a very, we're living in a very problematic moment in many ways. And I think anti-Semitism in a way also is indicative of deeper structural issues. It's almost like an early warning system. So there's xenophobia, all these things are increasing, but maybe as a part of this, in a very deeply disturbing and contradictory way, maybe the government will intervene to stop political movements on campus and even intellectual movements on campus that promote terrorism. So we're living in a very scattered moment. Yeah.
Should I discuss the Oxford?
Well, I think we'll take a break and then.
Are they also funding places like Notre Dame and Brigham Young, places that have strong religious direction and more try to maintain control?
It's a good question. I don't know about these two universities, but Tariq Ramadan was banned from the United States under the Bush administration, and literally the first thing that President Obama did when he came to power was unban Ramadan from going to the United States, and he got a position at Notre Dame. So it's interesting, yeah. And Georgetown is a Jesuit university, so they're around, yeah. They're in the space of interfaith dialogue. They're in the space.
All right, everybody. Thank you and welcome back. I hope we're all caffeinated up. So first of all, my name is Charlotte Littlewood, final year of my PhD, looking at a intra-minority conflict in the UK, the experiences of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, who are a Muslim group who believe in the ability for there to be prophets after Prophet Muhammad, causes them a lot of theological issues within broader Muslim communities, but also they were considered politically a problem. They've been marked as Zionists, and they have what they claim to be the most flourishing and safe and happy community living in Haifa. So they've been really interesting as a study, actually looking at how certain frames of thinking lend to discrimination of groups. And the Ahmadiyya, much like the Jewish communities, are facing a discrimination based on a frame of thinking that is rooted in power dynamics, oppressed groups, the West as all that's evil, colonialism and colonizers, and seeing groups as colonialists and colonizers. And Ahmadis have been sort of wrapped up in this too. So I found that really a useful PhD for me to better understand as well anti-Semitism. But my journey first did actually start in looking at anti-Semitism. I have written a report on anti-Semitism in schools in the UK, looked at how Holocaust studies are being approached and how a modern take and a modern understanding of anti-Semitism is needed to better tackle anti-Semitism as well. So that's a kind of rushed introduction into how these two things link, but I'm more than happy to answer your questions about PhD and Amadi's another time. But this is, today we're talking about a research project that I've had the honour of being able to do with Charles and ISGAP, and it's been truly shocking to look at the experience of Jewish students in the UK. The CST has done a report, I think it was just a year ago now, looking at anti-Semitism on campuses, and whilst anti-Semitism is the highest levels of anti-Semitism we've seen since records began in the UK, it's being most acutely felt on student campuses, and students are now opting to study from home, which is something we've seen at the University of Oxford as well. And we've seen the University of Oxford completely mishandle that, not support the students, and not make the students feel like they can be protected. And later we'll hear from Senna, who's had exactly the same experience at the University of Exeter. So trying to understand what is happening, why are Jewish students feeling so let down, why are they feeling physically threatened, why are some now looking at joining in the next academic year and scared to do so because they're seeing on social media threats of violence against Jewish students. Well, what is this crisis, or epidemic as it was called yesterday by Joanne Reid MP? What is this epidemic and what does it do? Why is it manifesting in such a way at university? So I have looked at the foreign funding, and I can tell you that the University of Oxford has had 2.39 million from the Qatar fund funding the HBKU chair, which was Tariq Ramadan, is now another professor who has links, or did her master's actually at a university that has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, so continues in that role as a Muslim Brotherhood linked by second-hand sort of link, but linked to, or perhaps has been influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, Tariq Ramadan, the grandson of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan Abana. So again, the HBKU chair at Oxford, funded by Qatar, is someone that perhaps we should have questions about. Bin Mahfouz, Charles introduced Bin Mahfouz, who has been donating generously to Pembroke College and has overseen events that have invited those that are being investigated for being Islamist extremist organisations onto campus. So he has directly overseen and been involved in the bringing onto campus of groups that our counter-extremism agenda in the UK is investigating for Islamist extremism. And the Margaret Thatcher Scholarship Trust, we know, has donated at least 3 million. We know the Qatar Development Fund has donated at least 3 million and has donated that over a number of times. So yes, there is funding from Qatar and the Qatar Foundation, and there are institutional links, as Charles has noted, from the Oxford Centre of Islamic Studies, which is heavily linked to the University of Oxford. All of the academic advisory board for OCIS are from the University of Oxford. OCIS funds scholarships for people to go to the University of Oxford, and there is just a backwards and forwards transfer of academics between the two. And that was, as we've said, opened by Yusuf Qaradawi, and Qaradawi was a trustee. So there are deep institutional links and funding links. And then you come, I think, what I find really fascinating is looking at the actual academics within the Middle East Centre. And having done my PhD, nearly finished, hope that they let me get it, that the Exeter as well has these same academics that meet with each other, move around these universities together, speak at each other's universities, go on podcasts together, endorse each other's books and publications. And there's probably between 5 or 10 of them that are really prolific. Avi Schleim is the one at the University of Oxford that's really concerning. And he regularly works alongside Ilan Pape, who's one of our really concerning ones at Exeter. And so I think just to give you a flavour of having tirelessly gone through their presentations and lectures and podcasts entries, what kind of things that's being said here. So Avi Schleim has called Hamas legitimate actors of resistance for the October 7th terrorist attack. I have video of him appearing at an encampment with a River to the Sea t-shirt on that he exposes at the end of his speech. He appears with Ilan Pape a number of times at various talks that are held at the University of Oxford, and one of them is a podcast. And Ilan Pape has asserted that Israel does not have the right to exist and wishes for Palestine from the river to the sea. He says that in an event that's organised by the Muslim Brotherhood-linked Cordoba Foundation. And at that very event was a senior Hamas member, Osama Hamdan. We then have on this same podcast series that's being hosted by the Middle East Centre, we have Noura Erakat, who has said that when Zionism has racialized non-Jews in Palestine, the subjugation of Middle Eastern and black Jews exposes the Zionist myth of one Jewish people and demonstrates the supremacy of a white Jewish establishment. She also argues Zionism is racism, and whereas Zionism seeks segregation and does not want to assimilate Jews with non-Jews, it's Nazism that doesn't want to integrate and assimilate Jews. So again, equating, as we see from various academics, this same repetition of equating Zionism to Nazism. To have these academics constantly speaking with each other on platforms at Oxford and within weeks of Noura Erakat, Nourerekat. To have these academics speak, especially on the podcast series, almost straight after each other, and then to speak at events together with no challenge. There's nothing else being entered into this echo chamber. What these academics are doing is teaching what to think and not how to think, and they are activists rather than academics. And what they're advocating for clearly crosses the line into anti-Semitism, and in some cases here we see outright support for a terrorist act. It just sort of leaves you speechless. It's dumbfounding that this exists at all. But then it isn't shocking to see the types of anti-Semitism at Oxford are predominantly, as it's seen across campuses, are predominantly Israel-Palestine linked. So we have Zionism is racism in one lecture theatre, and then we have victims of anti-Semitism, of which we have 102 so far and counting at Oxford. And the victims are saying, I have been shouted at, Zionism is racism, Zionism is a death cult, Zionist crazies should go back to America. These are clear echoes of what these students are picking up in these podcast series and in the lecture theatres. So I would put forward, whilst I can't prove causation, I can't prove that lecture led to that statement unless that particular propagator of anti-Semitism tells me such. I can say that it is very likely, considering it's exactly the same words, within a very close time frame of it being taught and the incident happening, that it's very likely that what is being taught by these academics is leading directly to anti-Semitism on campus. And these academics, as I noted, have had links to Muslim Brotherhood individuals, happy to share platforms, have praised, Avi Schleim has praised, that was Ilan Pape who praised that Muslim Brotherhood organisation and thanked them for having him on the Cordoba Foundation. So whilst anti-Semitism can exist without the Muslim Brotherhood, far left anti-Semitism can exist. The fact that the Muslim Brotherhood's clever entryist strategy to use the frames of anti-West, anti-colonialism, it's sort of taken control of the human rights narrative. That resonates so well with what we've seen, and Charles has talked about it, what Edward Said has taught, this far left academic approach to the question of Israel and Palestine. They resonate so well with each other that they are, in essence, banding together, and they're overlooking each other's uglies. So Avi Shleim is not worried that the Muslim Brotherhood is hugely anti-women and supremacist and anti-LGBT, because he cares about the anti-West, anti-colonialism, anti-Israel narrative. So he's going to overlook that, whilst the Muslim Brotherhood entities do not care that Avi Shleim might hold pro-LGBT values, because they're going to overlook that for the greater good, which is right now to defeat Israel. So whilst we can say that anti-Semitism can exist without Muslim Brotherhood, without funding, without these links, it's absolutely compounded and exaggerated, inflamed by the fact that these two ideologies, these two peoples are able to come together, share platforms, support each other, accepting funds from. There is a ecosystem that's being created that is deeply anti-Semitic, and I would argue is directly feeding into the anti-Semitism epidemic that we're seeing today. Any questions? Yeah.
I have two questions. One may be more of an observation. I wonder if we can't, if we're not, I like the idea of follow the money. I think there's a lot to be learned from that strategy. At the same time, we're not talking about poor institutions that have sold their souls in order to get Qatari money. We're talking about the rich at Yale and Oxford. We're talking about the richest institutions in the world. If they didn't get $10 billion, Cornell, they didn't get $1 billion or two from Qatar, they would be just fine. So something else critically has to be going on.
So I'll give you an example, a personal example from Exeter. My PhD thesis is politically unfashionable. It's looking at a conflict between Muslim communities, and it points the finger towards a radical element of Islam. So I didn't get any funding, and the funding that was available to the students of the Arab and Islamic Studies Centre was from the state of Shajara, a tiny little state, that is very anti-Ahmadi and also is not interested in funding anything to do with anti-Semitism or anything like that. So the students that could get funding are the students, and there's a huge Centre for Palestinian Studies that's really heavily funded. And the students that can get funding are the ones that are doing the topics that funding scholarship board want to fund, and it's quite simple that I was able to fund myself, but it means not every student was able to fund themselves, and it means that the bulk of students there are doing PhDs on a topic that satisfies the interests of funders that have ideological aims and interests themselves.
I mean, I see that. Sure, right? So these interests are buying influence.
Yeah.
Institutions, but not every group. The Sinaloa cartel in Mexico couldn't start funding programs at Oxford and Yale, right? Yale, they wouldn't take the money. So it's not just that the only money available is to fund quasi-anti-Semitic programs. It's the university makes a decision that this is okay. We wouldn't take this other money because that's dirty money, but we'll take this money.
Yeah.
Knowing perfectly well what the consequence is going to be.
Absolutely.
There's no consequence of taking this money. That's what we heard earlier.
Well, the consequence. What I mean is that they're going to be producing these kinds of students and these kinds of scholars.
Right.
Right. They don't have a problem with that.
The question of selectivity, I'd say, still has to be answered. Why this money and not that money? Why not Putin's money?
But
Putin's money is somehow not allowed because he's trying to shape brainwashing money.
But there's at least in the U.S. There's another aspect to this, and that's that the Qataris, the U.S. is driven by profit and by business, and the Qataris fund a lot of business. There are a lot of people who want to do business with the Qataris, so there are a lot of alumni that want to do business with Qatar. So Qatar is seen differently than the Mexican cartels, which people don't want to do business with the cartels.
Steve, that's your name, right?
Yeah.
I think what you're saying is there has to be some kind of cultural predisposition.
Yeah.
Right.
Universities.
That they are more inclined to accept this money than other money.
Absolutely.
And I think you're absolutely right. And I think like everybody in this room who does research on the subject would say there's a very strong cultural basis, an affinity towards anti-Semitism. No, there's a very strong cultural basis of anti-Semitism everywhere in the Western world, and that partially explains also a certain affinity to these kind of ideologies, right? So it's not only simply that they offer the assets. There's also some kind of that. I think that partially answers your question, right? I mean, it's like, oh, this is what you're implying, actually, saying there's some kind of affinity. And it's not simply like in a top-bottom way that this ideology is imposed, right, all of a sudden by like some small circle of Muslim brothers. It's like, okay, we give you the money and then you become anti-Semitic. Obviously, like anti-Semitism is a phenomenon that originates like in
If you went around my university,
right,
and you said to people,
right,
how do you feel about Edward Said? I love that. What do you think about capitalism? I hate capitalism. Right? I mean, that's the ideological culture of American academia. That's my impression anyway.
But if you went around to Wall Street and say, "Are you doing business with the Qataris?" and people would say, "No, I haven't made a connection yet. Do you know one?" And these are the alumni from these Ivy League and top universities. They're captains of industry, and they want to do business with Qatari because it's big business.
Yeah.
So they put pressure on the university. Yeah, make friends with Qatar. We want that connection with Qatar. We get it through our alumni association.
I guess this is a question for Charles in Charlotte. Is there evidence of that kind of motivation in explaining this sort of ecology of money that comes into these institutions?
Yeah, I think there's two things. We did one report we show the correlation between Qatari funding and anti-Semitism. So we discovered that the causation is not scientifically, statistically proven, but there's some connections. American universities that are taking money from Qatar have 300% more instances of anti-Semitism compared to American universities that don't take money. So methodologically, statistically speaking, from a rigorous academic perspective, it's a solid study, but it could be stronger, but it's a good indication. Look, we have a postdoctoral program here, and we've been welcomed very nicely into the Woolf Institute. And our whole program probably costs us, £250,000 a year, and they've been wonderful. And they know that, let's say they wanted to insist that we take a researcher that, wants to destroy Israel. We wouldn't accept it. They know it. We have a good relationship. They're taking place within a certain paradigm. If I came to Cambridge with $10 billion, $1.3 billion, it'd be more than a part of it. And I may not be investing in, let's say, pro-Israeli, pro-Jewish programs, but it's soft power. Be something in communication, something in history, something in the sciences, cure for cancer, bring for scholars to Israel to train them and give them a little bit, pay them significantly higher than the United States to come for a semester and see Israel get, business class tickets and 6-star hotels. And, they'll leave with a good impression, even though it's not dealing specifically with Jewish issues or Israeli issues.
Is your sense that Cambridge or anyplace else, right, would be as open to accepting openly Zionist scientists as they are to accepting openly anti-Zionist scientists?
So I think I think Israeli American, Israeli-British academic scientific exchanges were, operating at the highest levels of even integration. Technion just opened a campus at off Manhattan, and there's all sorts of these type of projects. But I think after October the 7th, with this explosion of anti-Semitism in academia, the relations are being threatened.
Right. Steve, I think what you're hinting is very important, because basically the question you're asking, so Charles is saying 300% more cases of anti-Semitism in universities accept money from the Muslim Brotherhood. The question is, from Qatar, right? What if there's a hen or the egg, right? Are they more anti-Semitic because they accept the money, or do they accept the money because they're more anti-Semitic? And would they accept the same money if it would come from a rich Zionist, right? And actually, if you look at the BDS movement, right, and what all the people are demanding, like in the campus protests and here, like in front of King's College, divest, like King's College should not invest, in these companies and should not make money with all these Zionist companies or with some companies where they construct some kind of connection of Zionist support, right? Because this company is involved with the second company and with the third company, and they have a stake in
Even if look at The Guardian today.
Right.
There's a very interesting article about the connection to Microsoft with the Israeli government and army. But you should read it, read the tone of it. It's the front page of The Guardian today.
So basically, these people make a point of not accepting money from certain kind of actors because of ideological reasons, right? And these are the same people that accept the money from Qatar. So I think you're absolutely right in asking the questions, right? Are they influenced by the money, or partially accepting the money because they have an ideological predisposition?
And yet at the same time, Yale, Harvard don't say, or Penn don't say, we're not going to take any more donations from Jewish donors, and we're getting rid of all the Jews, because that's a lot of money too.
But there are Jewish philanthropists that are withdrawing their money,
Yes.
and nothing is happening. Nothing is happening.
I think looking at what you can recommend to these universities, as you're rightly saying there, what money are they denying? What money are they turning down? Are they turning down? I don't think they are turning down Zionist money. that would be absolutely awful. But I think what the universities are lacking and have for a while, and it's been going in this direction, is a commitment to a balance and a plurality of thought, and a commitment to the approach to education in which people are taught to interrogate sources, challenge themselves, engage with different ideas. And I would argue that if they're going to be taking lots of money from Qatar, and that's going to be influencing perhaps who they appoint or who gets PhD funding, and in some way has a soft influence then trickling down the path on what's taught in the culture, they have to then commit to having an equal and opposing view, even if that's just in what's set in the reading lists. The reading lists at Exeter are Edward Said, Ilan Pape, and nothing much else. And I came to mark one of these essays and I found it to be anti-Semitic, and it argued Zionism was racism and it had no other viewpoint. I didn't tell the student that it was anti-Semitic. I told the student that it lacked engagement with debate and other views, and therefore lacked an argument which it needed for a higher mark. That came back from the head marker to say, no, sorry Charlotte, that's what we teach, so you can't mark that student down. I think if universities are going to be accepting this money, if it turns out there's nothing we can do about stopping them accepting this money, and we might be able to do something about it. I know Charles has had success in the States with this. But if it happens that these are businesses, they can take this money as long as this money is not directly paying for a decolonialization of the curriculum project, and it's all very ideological, because quite often the stuff that they're paying for, it might be like sciences and stuff like that. So it might be that we can't stop them taking the money, but we could insist that there is balance and that there are reading lists are balanced, that there is a balance in what's taught, and that the line between teaching and activism is really monitored as well. I mean, definitely these academics that have been having River to the Sea t-shirts and saying that the Hamas attack was a message of resistance, they need to be investigated. But more than that, I think just the culture across universities, across country needs to be looked at in what's taught and balance. And whilst we can't stop the funding, we can perhaps insist on balance.
I think to this point that you highlighted, I would say this. When I look at the social sciences in general, internally but also compared to STEM sciences, one thing that was always I would say, surprising for somebody who's an economist, for example, is that when you speak to sociologists, anthropologists, or even historians, or a little less so, but within social sciences, those that I listen, these are sciences that, or at least fields that appear to us as fields without canonical curriculum. In the sense that when you meet people across different universities, within a single country, let alone across other countries, you never quite know what they studied. Let's say you already studied sociology, and this is the list of your books. There's no guarantee that another sociologist would study something like that. In economics, books may not be the same because there's a curriculum, but nobody would come out of university, without something very structured. Microeconomics, macroeconomics, price theory, and something like that. Everybody learned that. Everybody.
So I actually think...
So when you enforce that from the above, in the sense that this is true of all sciences, so that there's some sort of international society, whether it's MESA or what, Middle Eastern Studies, for example, association, that creates an agreed curriculum. Within that curriculum, it's understood that people who have gone through Middle Eastern studies have learned about medieval Islam, for example, ancient Islam, evolution of the contemporary Middle East with certain countries, and perspectives on that, different perspectives. It's sort of these situations that you sort of describe with this extreme bias, what can be anti-Semitic, or can be something else, will be taken care at the core, as long as there is an internationally agreed broad curriculum, like in, I'm sorry to say, other fields.
Yeah. I think a consistent curriculum has developed, sort of, and I think you'll find Edward Said across most universities' approaches to understanding the Middle East and how to study Middle Eastern cultures and things like that. The problem is what's developed is an over-reliance on a handful of academics that all have the same view, and it's a very West-hating, based in the British Empire's approach to the Middle East, and how it's stuck at that point, and it's stuck in a point of feeling sorry for oneself for now generations later being British and white. So I think what has to happen is I think there is a curriculum. I think it has sort of evolved naturally through that prism and that frame of thinking that is inherently linked to sort of academic and universities culture. That needs to be challenged. I think it's naturally, in some ways, sort of naturally evolved without anyone really taking much notice. And now we're seeing the result is an anti-Semitism crisis on campus. And if you think about it, like universities are like the highway of fashion that then trickles down to your Tesco's and your H&M, and that's the street. And the university is setting this high way of thinking about this, and this is trickling down to then Jews being attacked on the streets in London.
Right, but that's exactly the point. The problem is not the remorse about Western colonial crimes. The problem is that all of a sudden Israel becomes a symbol for things like Western colonial crimes. Like, this is like the actual question.
Yeah. And I think there needs to be a reckoning with what has developed as a curriculum. I think that is quite consistent. And I don't think it's ever been looked at, ever, what is being taught. What is being taught now?
Yeah, well, that's the problem. I would like to make another point, which I prepared before you said what you said, and that is about the unholy alliances, so to speak. We use that term, red-green alliance, and I think a lot of people wonder, how do these people cope with contradictions? These hate LGBT, let's say, this fraction of them. Those who don't hate LGBT or even promote them, do they mind that? How does this happen? I think, speaking from the experience of other all sorts of revolutionary movements or anti-establishment movements, that thing is quite usual in them historically. It's not very well mapped, but these kind of alliances existed, for example, even in the Iranian Revolution. The fraction that won was Islamic, but the fractions that pushed the revolution from below, in actual fact, were not. They were communists, and there were all sorts of left liberals that basically converged because they hated the Shah of Iran. And there are ample documentation of that some left liberals developed liking for Khomeini. He was serious, he never smiling, never light-hearted. There was something charismatic, attractive about that man. So then the left liberals either went out of Iran, they left, they immigrated, or they ended up in fridges, quite frankly. So that happened.
Yeah,
What happened was the same happened in the transition from the Soviet Union, let's say, to the post-Soviet Union Russia, where you see people that really don't belong together, promoting the same cause very amicably, because they have nothing divides them. What unites them is hatred. Alexander Dugin, which is now the major formulator of new Eurasian view, is known to anyone who paid attention to Russia from that time, from the 80s. He was at the time promoter of this new strange sort of nationalism, Eurasian nationalism. His wife, his actual living, physical, realistic wife, was the head of the LGBT movement. Okay, I'm not trying to explain what happened between them. I'm stating it as a fact. They divorced since then, it's not a big surprise, but they operated together against the Soviet authorities. Go figure. By now it's much clearer what's going on.
It's interesting in this present moment. I have looked into what, I don't know if you know of this Islamist organisation in the UK, a news platform called 5 Pillars that has various young, hip Islamist influencers that have big followings and very influential. And they've done some work with Andrew Tate, and they have far reach. They've got a lot of reach among young people. And there was an interesting interview, it's about a year ago, and I've recently been rewatching it for my PhD thesis, where they ask exactly that. Okay, we're working with the left right now on the cause of Palestine. That seems to be quite a useful ally. But what about LGBT, and do you not think they're going to turn on us at some point and force us to have to teach LGBT in schools, because they're very heavily they campaign against that a lot. And it's really interesting. They kind of have a bit of a laugh about it, and they say, it's a useful allegiance, but ultimately this is all for Allah. We do this for Allah, where people can come alongside, but we're not friends, and they're useful to us. And it was really quite sinister. But then and they were aware, they were conscious and were aware and commented on the fact that the left is there because they care, and they kind of were conscious of that, and they said, but we're here for Allah, and we have our mission. Our mission is to be there for Palestine, and if the left want to come along because they care for minorities right now, and Muslims are facing Islamophobia in the UK, and therefore they're with us right now, they can. But we will not be friends if they come head-to-head with us on LGBT.
But that explains, while the Islamists work with a progressive left, right?
Yeah.
But the question that remains, and this is a question that comes up a lot, right? Came up today like a few times, it came up yesterday, right? How come that the progressive left, right, tolerates all these like anti-progressive,
because they see them as oppressed.
All these other, like anti-egalitarian views that you have in Islamist worldview. So I want to share something about that. There is actually research into cognitive belief in conspiracy fantasies. I can send you the reference later. I don't have it here right now, but I can find it. where actually people are asked on a Likert scale to indicate their approval of certain kind of like conspiratorial ideas,
Yeah.
right? So they're asked about the conspiracy fantasies that Osama bin Laden is still alive, right? And then they have to like check on a Likert scale from 1 to 10, I don't know to which degree they approve. And then they ask to which extent do you agree with the idea that Osama bin Laden was already dead before the Americans went into Afghanistan, right? And it turns out that the same people who agree more with the one also agree more with the second. So right, so they actually they agree. So the two ideas are contradictory, right? I mean, if Osama bin Laden is still alive, he could not have been dead already before the Americans walk in, right? But this is a point. It shows how conspiratorial thinking works, right? You subordinate, like there's a certain kind of thing you do want to believe, right? And anti-Semitism essentially is a conspiracy, like a large part of it is a conspiracy fantasy, right? The Zionists said they control everything, they're like behind, like, you know, the bad things in the world, there's a symbol for racism and apartheid and everything that is like bad, right? So other things are simply subordinated. This is like in terms of social psychology, how conspiratorial thinking actually works, right? And we have that in other contexts, that simply other aspects of a world you are being marginalized, right? Because this is like what is the focus of.
So I absolutely agree that is a considerable part of it, but the overlooking of the Muslim, the elements within more, I wouldn't say it's all Islamist, but conservative elements within Islam as well, not just Islamism, but issues about LGBT and women. Overlooking that is the oppressor and oppressed paradigm that the far left is situated within, that's their lens, that the Muslims in the UK, they see them and have understood through heavy campaigning that Islamophobia is raging in the UK and that it is the worst threat, and that Muslims are about to face annihilation in the UK. Is kind of rhetoric coming from some of the Islamist groups that Islamophobia is an issue in the UK, but they really ramp it up and exaggerate that issue, and they talk about it in a East versus West, West oppressing Islamic states, and by virtue, therefore, the UK and British establishment oppresses Muslims as part of a sort of a continuation of colonialism within our own borders, against our own minorities. And it's that way of it being looked at, that understanding, that causes the far left to not be able to see issue within Muslim communities and not be able to address issues in Muslim communities, because to do that is to be a white person talking about an issue within a brown community, and therefore is seen as a colonial act in its of self and an oppressive act. And what has been so well argued by academics and has been sort of as brainwashed sections of the far left is that Jews are a part of a white oppressive class. So therefore they cannot be seen as a minority and they cannot be seen as abused. And I think, actually that is a really good segue to Senna, because Senna has had an exact experience where that has happened for her in the classroom, where she has been seen, well not she, but where a case has been seen as Jews as the oppressors and therefore could not face any kind of oppression, and that was taught directly from a lecturer to Senna. And so I think that's a reason why the Muslim communities, the extreme sections of them are often worked with by the far left, is not just because of conspiracy around anti-Semitism and that being something they easily then fall into. It's because they themselves are in this cautionary paradigm of not wanting to be seen as the oppressor, and so they don't want to get involved in these issues at all, and they then align themselves with who they think are the most oppressed in society, and the Jews just simply can't fit into that box for them. So Senna, I'm going to pass over to you.
I'll just go straight in. I am going to talk about what Charlotte's mentioned, but firstly, I think it will make sense to start off from October 7th. As a Jewish student at Exeter University, it all really did start not start, but it kind of kicked off on October 7th when, as Charles pointed out, one of the SJP groups actually sent messages into group chats to congratulate the Al-Majdaw brigades on cooking kebab out of Jews, and they used maklube, which is like an Arabic word for kebab, I guess. So it really did go straight in on October 7th, and from there it kind of played out as a catastrophe for my own Jewish community in Exeter. And I can only really speak for Exeter because that's what I've experienced, and like I can give examples that I've kind of seen myself. But coming on to what Charlotte said, in November of 2023, just after October 7th, we had academics at the Centre for Palestinian Studies, which I think we're the only one in Europe to have. There were lecturers which spoke directly about excusing the Hamas attacks and how we must now be in solidarity with the Palestinian students that are on our campus. And a lot of the student community, especially within my year group or kind of like people that I associated with attended, there was hundreds of students there from videos and photos that I saw. Following that, we had an event on campus where my Jewish community wanted to go out and just, you know, show that we existed after everything that happened. And we were quite clearly thrown off campus, like with juice thrown at us. It was red juice thrown on our Israeli flag to paint it with blood, I guess. And there were just ridiculous anti-Semitic things said, such as, you know, you're white colonizers, you're baby killers, all of these kinds of like things that we've obviously heard before, but when you experience it, it's quite scary, I must say. And then from then onwards, I started to almost monitor my own campus because I realized my university was failing to do that. And the reasons are outlined by what Charlotte and Charles pointed out, you know, with the funding and the acceptance of these academics on our campus environment. It went into one of our members of staff who's a female member of staff, and my first interaction with her started 3 years before that. I was on the Cornwall campus in Exeter, and basically she was the lecturer for Edward. She did all of the Orientalism, kind of like Edward said, discourse. She taught all of that, all of the Israel-Palestine work she would teach on that campus. And her anti-Semitism caused me to request to change my campus into main Exeter. And it got approved. I did give evidence for that to the university. And then I came across to her in a session with 400 or 500 people all across the country. And I asked a question because it was on Palestine and women and feminism. So I said, you know, what do you think on what happened to women on October the 7th? And the immediate response by this female member of staff was that Israeli women inherently couldn't be raped or be subject to any kind of violence in any shape or form because they were the oppressor. And ultimately in her discourse and her theory, I guess, the oppressor can't be oppressed. This is literally what she explained. It took her about a few minutes to explain that. I think she had to pick her words very carefully because ultimately that's what got her to remain in her position at the university, even though there was evidence of my video and my complaint. She remained in her position, and the university stated that this was academic freedom, and this was her look on what had happened. So it was accepted, and the case was closed. So all of these experiences and examples, I think, just show how important it is, you know, the work of Charlotte and Charles and ISGAP. Following the money is great, but also we have to look at how this actually affects people and what this means. Like, yes, these people are investing money into our universities and our educational facilities and our institutions, but it's more than that, and this actually has a really big effect on students right now in campuses. And I actually had to leave my campus in March when I graduated in July. I was advised by the CST, and my mum's here. She was not happy to hear that. I left my campus on, I think, not even end of March, because I was advised that, you know, I could be followed home after what I had done. All I had done was go out into campus with an Israeli flag and say that I was open for conversation, because the balance was lacking against, as Charlotte said, within my classrooms, lecturers, they would relate the most absurd things to Israel and Palestine, like it had nothing to do with what was going on. And, it's tragic what's going on, but it just had nothing to do with that. But it would relate to it somehow. And it was shocking as a student that I was at such a prestigious university and somehow everything had to be about Israel and Palestine. That's kind of like my experience. There is probably more that would come out from other universities if we look at it. And I also just want to finish off by saying I've recently seen that Danny Dayan, who's the chairman of the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum, drew parallels between Heidelberg University in the 1930s and Columbia now. I mean, everyone should have heard about what's going on in Columbia. And the leadership and how leadership and institutions are failing to uphold and commit to the truth and rationality within academic principles. And ultimately, that's why Jewish and Zionist students are experiencing what they're experiencing. And my professional work over the last 6 months has been working with Camera UK. We are a media monitoring organisation, but we have a campus department where I work with students across the country now and in Northern Ireland on the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism they face on campus. And it's been scary. Another example is from King's College. I'm not sure if any of you have heard, but a current lecturer is under investigation for teaching literal sections of the Hamas Charter. So nothing's been done. This has been reported. This is under investigation, but we shall see what comes out of that. Yeah,
What's the relationship between Canberra, the UK, and the United States and Canada?
It's very clear. So basically, Canberra is established in the US, the UK, and Israel, and we operate in 5 languages, Arabic. And also, I just want to point out, we are the only organisation that monitors Arabic media. Like, that's actually scary, that Arabic media serves millions and probably billions of people, but we are the only organisation that monitors that. So we work with BBC Arabic, the New York, gone out of my head, the Times, Washington Post, all of the big, the Guardian in the UK especially. But on a campus part of it, we monitor how, so again, the work that you do, not exactly, but we monitor the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism on campus and how our students can fight back, if you like. It's been quite hard. I mean, yesterday, David mentioned it from the CST. Some students, especially Jewish, like openly Jewish students, want to kind of walk away and stay quiet and almost, protect themselves. I completely understand, but there's a whole lot that has chosen to fight back and be much more vocal.
Can I just ask, have you finished now with the university? Have you graduated?
Yes, thankfully I did graduate. Yeah, I've been in professional work for 6 months now. But again, I graduated in July and I had to leave campus in March because of safety risks.
Did the university help you?
No.
Where you had to leave?
No, yes, I did make them aware. The only thing that they said to me was, we're now launching an investigation into what happened at the stall and what happened with that lecturer. And then I think they got back in September, so months later, to say that all of them were closed. And with the stall, actually, where we were attacked by hundreds, it was all over the news in the UK. They said that the investigation was closed and they couldn't give us any information because there was nothing anti-Semitic that was done. Despite I have video evidence still of what was said. The hundreds of students were questioning where my family was from. Are you from Europe? And if you are, then you don't belong to the Middle East. To their surprise, I am actually a Mizrahi Jew. I'm Kurdish as well. So that came as a surprise to them. But many of my friends who were with me, they unfortunately had to endure that.
I apologize for beating this drum. But let's sort of accept the intellectual culture of the university. Right. Rishi Sunak is not Jeremy Corbyn. Right. Number one. Number two, the British government does not seem particularly averse to punishing speech it doesn't like. How is it that, I mean, the government tolerates this kind of activity in speech? What are they thinking?
Such a big question. I don't think I have the answer to that, but with regards to the freedom of speech, I will say I am a supporter of freedom of speech, and that has to be present, not just for myself, but for everyone. The issue that comes into play here, especially on campuses, is that freedom of speech is only available for one side. And I have experienced that firsthand. You know, I want the other side, if you like, to have the ability to speak on what they deem to be a problem. But I also want myself to be able to speak openly about what I think is a problem. And there is clear evidence, especially when I went out on a stall, that this is not available. Because as soon as we were out there was about 7 of us, and no joke, like 100 to 200 people. It's all evident in the videos. And the university lied to these students and threw us under the bus, because the students were asking, did you allow these camera materials to be available? There was materials about the IRA definition of anti-Semitism that they were ripping up and throwing in our faces. And the university leaders who stood there right in front of me said, no, we didn't know that these were going to be present. I have email evidence that I sent these materials and they approved it. So it shows clearly that, you know, our institutions are scared as well, I think, because what else could it be, you know? They threw 7 Jewish students under the bus rather than say, yes, we've approved it and these students can legitimately sit here and do what they're doing. It is a way of silencing us, if not anything else, really. Why they're not doing anything, I don't know.
I think to your point, this whole concept of this freedom of speech, which everyone endorses, and nobody will say, okay, I'm against the freedom of speech. It's an inconceivable statement from anyone, individual, institution. One thing about it that is very striking is contextuality. These terms and the legal provisions around them were all developed, well, as far as I'm concerned, and I may be wrong, but not by a mile, somewhere in the 19th century, where having freedom of speech basically meant that you could criticize church. You could say something like, okay, there was evolution and not creation, or I don't believe in God. You could say it in public, right? And that was somehow an amazing act of intellectual bravery, you know, you challenge people, oh, everyone should be equal, even Catholics can go to the university. Something like that. That is the kind of a freedom of speech. Or maybe then, moving up a gear, 60s, okay, people can live together without marriage, okay, or maybe they can't, all that. And at no point, I think, there was or at least I can't see how, there was a situation where actually approving, sort of having blanket approval of that means that the society will destroy itself. That it will approve and kosherize, so to speak, forces that will eat it from inside. Forces that doubted or approved evolution were not like that. Free marriage and love also were not like that, but these are. Not only them, by the way, also perhaps communist ideology, because it basically, in a very declarative way, said that we want to destroy the society. We want to shave off its foundation and build something new. I'm not imputing anything, that's what they said. So, so I think it's just misapplied, but nobody owns that. And nobody knows how to redefine it and say, okay, up to here. This freedom of speech, you can have it within the books, outside of the books, you can't.
Well, in the UK, I mean, it's different in the US, I know for sure, but in the UK, you are bound by the law within your freedom of speech. And a lot of what's been said, so like Ilan Pape is somebody I focused on a lot with Charlotte, because I've had numerous interactions with him, and he genuinely is a horrible man. Forgetting his ideological, he's just a horrible man to interact with. He's not a nice person in the sense that his ideology has overshadowed everything in him, I think, as a human, that when he addresses us as students, you know, I'm 20 now, I was 19 and 18 when I was at university, he would address us in the campus newspaper and make us a clear target for all of the other students. You know, we might differ on our beliefs, but you don't need to do that to students. And I think with the freedom of speech and, you know, putting a limit on it, academics like him and Avi and, you know, Chomsky and etc., all of these people, they are very, very careful in the way they say things. So after October 7th, Ilan Pappé went out into he did like a news thing with Al Jazeera, I think, and he picked his words so carefully that you couldn't sue him for what he'd said, because clearly he was saying something that wasn't nice, but they're very, very careful about the way they do and say things, that it's almost impossible to grab them for something that they do. I think that's one thing I experienced a lot when I was submitting like reports and complaining at university, is that it's so difficult to find them, to get them caught in some sense.
Also, I mean, this inversion of hate speech and enlightenment, or hate speech and free speech, right? This is actually something like very, very deeply rooted in anti-Semitism, right? Heinrich von Kreitschke, the man who said, like, the Jews are a misfortune, complained about that he's being criticized, right, for what other people said, like, was anti-Jewish belief. I was just, like, legitimately criticizing, like, a religion, but I'm, like, you know, discriminated as a hater. So, like, one thing that anti-Semitism does, not only today, but no, it's important to understand, this is, like, not a novelty of the contemporary discourse. This is something that is ingrained in anti-Semitic thought, right? To reframe what in fact is discrimination, right, as an act of free speech, as an act of, like, you know, enacting free speech, and, like, on the other way, enacting the criticism of their own anti-Semitic discrimination, enacting that as a form of discrimination in itself. Right? This reversal, this inversion of free speech and criticism and discrimination. This is something that is very deeply ingrained in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic thought. It has something to do with the self-perception of anti-Semitism as not a form of discrimination, but as, like, a struggle against oppression of, like, elites or, like, groups hallucinated of being overly powerful. Right? And it's not exclusive to the contemporary discourse.
Perhaps a bit of a philosophical question. Do you think it's possible to change the way in which people think about these things, which are quite deep and quite ideological, in Israel, Palestine, and all the jazz? And if so, what do you think is the best strategy of winning, you know, hearts and souls and convincing? I suppose your target is not Islamists themselves, but the bystanders, right? Westerners who kind of buy into that stuff, right? So you want to win over those people. So what do you think is the best strategy of doing so? Because what you've been talking about so far is kind of more the prosecution aspect of it, or changing the rules of the game, right? Which is kind of one of the strategies, but probably will not help you to achieve that second goal, right? So what's
I think this comes back to earlier when you asked the question of, like, the funding. Is it the ideas that draw the funding, or is it the funding that creates the ideas? I think it's a process. So Charles mentioned the process, well, you know, the process of, currently in the UK, I think they said £150 million has been given to universities, I think roundabouts they mentioned. Whereas in the US, this is on a far bigger scale. But I'm sure, maybe Charlotte can correct me if I'm wrong, but Charles can correct me if I'm wrong, but this must have been a process in the US as well. You know, Qatar didn't come in one day and give 10 billion in one day. They did this through a process. In the UK, I think we can see that this is a process as well. So changing the ideas of people isn't going to happen overnight. And I think this is what's scary for me, myself, and my community at the moment, that they have in a way succeeded to win over a great majority of people on our campuses and universities and in very important spaces of our institutions. But we can't be that passive, and, you know, we can't lose hope. I think the hope is that this is going to be a process to then turn this around, you know. And I think that process starts on campuses with Jewish students fighting back with what's going on with their academics. You know, sitting in a classroom when you've got family in Israel, or you know people directly affected by what's been going on, or you're a Jewish student who you know if you go out to say anything that might not go with the norm, you'll be attacked, is very, very difficult. But a lot of our Jewish students are doing that anyway. You know I did that. You know, I had to go into class every single week with one of my lecturers who was directly anti-Semitic, you know. It's very hard to prove it, but you know when you know. And I think that's how this process is going to begin, because I didn't stay silent. It was very difficult. I mean, my mom's there, and the breakdowns, the effect on my mental health was great, but it's a process, and it's been the same on the other side. This didn't happen overnight. The funding, the ideological warfare, I'd like to say, has been a process. So again, it's going to be the same on us. We're going to have to fight back. And when it comes to the law, I don't think that, well, this is my opinion, I don't think that legally we have to change a lot of things. I think we just have to implement what we have in the UK as well. You know, we don't need to change the laws to suit the Jews and Israelis, or the Zionists, if you like, because it just comes out that the laws are on our side. It's that our institutions are fighting back to implement these laws because the majority of the other side, or the other communities, are fighting, you know? And I've seen this on university campuses where my university had adopted the IRA definition, but they refused to implement it. And they refuse to implement it because they have people like Ilan Pappé who talk about the destruction of Israel and doesn't think about the effect on Jewish students or how this will affect the IRA definition that Exeter adopted. All Exeter has to do is to draw the line and say, actually, look, we've adopted this, or there is a legal framework, and they just have to implement what they've already got. But it's actually, most of my work, especially professionally now with CAMA, and I'm sure with ISGAP and all of these organizations, is that we just want our institutions to use what they have, because actually in a lot of cases that is enough. Not in all, and I guess in that sense it will have to change, but the facts are on Israel's side, and the laws are on our side on campuses. It's just that they're not being implemented. And I think that's why we feel so let down, because we know that we can be protected and we can be safer on campus and we can actually have the free speech that we're allowed to have, but we're not, because people are changing it to suit situations and contextual issues, etc. I think that's been the hardest part, because I'm fighting back, saying, look, I know that I'm right in this, and please, could you just do what you're supposed to do? But the issue's been that they say, no, we're not going to do that because of X, Y, and Z. Yeah.
I have a kind of a slightly different take on the question that you posed. And I'm an American. I'm a free speech absolutist. I argue with my students all the time. Hate speech is free speech. It's what the Constitution says and the Supreme Court says.
Actually, the Constitution says that you can't do it if it's going to cause harm or incite riot.
Right. But if it's not, if it doesn't meet that standard, right? So you can say,
Unless you're a woman or a
you can say, I support the elimination of all Jews in the world. No problem from the Supreme Court. You say, look over there, there's a group of Jews, let's go kill them. That's incitement. That can't. And so I like speech. On the other hand, I'm dubious about how many minds can be changed. I think people have different perspectives, and the question is not about pouring in resources to change minds, because I don't think minds are going to be all that changed. And so for me, the question is not really about speech, the question is about action. And I think you sort of suggest the same thing, right? That if people want to stand on the street corner and shout heinous things, I was always told it's a free country that you do that. If they want to stop harassing me and abridging my rights, that's action, and that should not be tolerated. And so that's sort of where the line was for me with the Intifada. When I put up a tent, I think the universities should have respected their own rules about time, place, and manner, which they didn't.
I don't want to interrupt. I'll respond when you finish. I don't want to interrupt you. So.
No. But it's when Jews are obstructed from going to their classes, right? And they're being harassed. That's not speech, that's action. And that's where I think the line needs to
But
be
isn't
drawn.
there a double standard? You're at the University of Vermont. I grew up in
Go
Montreal.
Catamounts.
Yeah, I grew up in Montreal, Vermont. It's a very nice, liberal, good university. I have a question for you. Would your colleagues who tolerate free speech when it comes to issues of anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli politics, and making Jewish faculty and students feel uncomfortable, unless they really buy into this whole postmodern stuff, I love Judith Butler and the others. You know, I told Judith Butler if I go to Gaza or Tehran and get one bullet, she get 3 bullets, right? She's queer, she's a feminist, she's a career.
But she supports them,
Yeah,
vocally supports them.
yeah, she sees Hamas and Hezbollah as part of the progressive global left, literally. What would happen, instead of SJP on campus, we had the young KKK on campus. And a group of Germans and South African white people were supporting centers of eugenics instead of Middle East studies. And then the KKK Student Association started building burning crosses in the middle of campus. That would be free speech in that bloody college of yours?
No, but that's precisely
No.
where
No.
all those college presidents got into trouble last year with Congress, right? Because their position on free speech was hypocritical.
But-
Because if you had said about, say, African Americans what people were saying about Jews, you'd have been off campus before you could say Jack Robinson.
Right.
But they were tolerating where they were not tolerating. You know, they were.
But isn't this a contradictory situation where you're a free speech absolutist, but I know the people on the campuses in the United States, the progressive liberal First Amendment champions, would not tolerate certain speech. But when it comes to the Jews, they
I think that's absolutely
probably
right.
more required.
But I'm in various organizations, and there are things that I don't oppose. Even I don't oppose them actively, although I think they're terrible. Like people, supporting Hamas on campus. I don't like it, but I think it's free speech.
But what happens? This is not a rhetorical question. This is a real question. So we're trying to create a policy with ISGAP and other people in this space in Washington. We'd like to ban the Muslim Brotherhood from the United States. Ban the Muslim Brotherhood.
Sure.
And people say it's impossible because there's freedom of expression, there's political freedom. You can't ban a political party or an ideology. But here's the question. Up until a few years ago, I think this was sort of a conceptual debate, where you have First Amendment, free speech, and people saying ugly things, and this is the American way, and put light on it. You fight bad speech with better and more good speech, and all these arguments. But now it's crossed the line. Now we really have violence, right? All this rhetoric has been causing violence. Young Jewish students, faculty members, people on the streets. This ideology that's been inciting hatred through speech is now actually, there's crimes being committed on a regular basis.
And breaking the law, because we're talking about
So
Title
now,
VI, right?
in light of that, it's not just a conceptual debate, there's crimes being committed on a regular basis because of this ideology. Then what? From your perspective?
Execute crimes. That's my opinion. If somebody breaks the law, they should be prosecuted. If you're not breaking the law, then you don't have the right to prosecute them.
I'll tell you once, I grew up in Canada, so we have hate legislation. I
Right.
defer to the Canadian legal system. The American one scares me. But we wanted to have a mock trial at the Yale Law School on whether Ahmadinejad was inciting to genocide. And we were going to have Floyd Abrams and Erwin Kotler and Dershowitz, all these legal scholars and top students from the law school who participated in this day-long mock trial. And the professors at the law school wouldn't allow me to do it. And they said that American law trumps international law. I shouldn't use the word Trump. It trumps international law. And that incitement to genocide or incitement to genocide based on American law only becomes incitement to genocide when a genocide has occurred.
Wow.
Because until the genocide occurs, there's no action and there's free speech.
Well, think there's a difference between a call for genocide and incitement to genocide, right?
Well, according to these legal, top legal scholars at the Yale Law School, some of the best in the world, this is why they wouldn't allow us to do the mock trial. If the genocide happened, then we could have a conversation or a trial and incitement.
That's where application
Crazy.
of dated things leads.
That what?
Dated concepts. Free speech in its current version, it's alter Sache. It's not fit for purpose.
But if the Chinese control TikTok, this is a problem.
Well, but the U.S. has laws on you couldn't ban a Catholic Church, right? But you could ban some, I don't know, hypothetical terrorist group that funded by Rome.
Yeah.
And it's just like you might not want to. I don't mean to suggest that the papacy is up to no good, but so I think there are distinctions, right? And I think you know better than I do because this is your life. It's not my life, but the Islamic Brotherhood, if it could be demonstrated in court or in front of Congress, right, that this was a terrorist organization. Trump just declared the Houthis a terrorist organization yesterday, right? He could do the same for the Islamic Brotherhood. I'm sure that the government would be sued.
Yeah, they would be by immediately. But maybe it would stand up. It's interesting.
I'm curious, were there faculty or staff, or other students for that matter, that expressed support for you and the others, but that were very quiet about it, that weren't willing to be public?
I was in contact with one, and our chaplain was another. Charlotte actually, she has so much more because she worked with these people. So one of the Jewish members of staff in the Arabic and Islamic Studies department, the only Jew, on October the 7th, he had stickers and things left on his laptop and his desk. And when he asked one of the students who was there, again, a PhD student that Charlotte knew well as well, he replied that there was a genocide going on and this is how he was going to... there was a genocide going on towards the Palestinians, but he was going to celebrate what happened to the Jews on October 7th because this was their way of resisting. That's how he explained himself. And this person was actually one of the people that led the protests on our campus every week. There was not a lot of support, but what I will say is one of my lecturers who didn't know about much of this going on because they just didn't really engage with a lot of the politics on campus and, the whatever, he came out and said that he couldn't believe that I was saying that this was about the same university he taught at. And I said, all you have to do is walk out of the classroom on a Wednesday, which is when they held the protest, and just look at how many academics were there. Like, my lecturers were standing there with the people protesting and screaming Intifada revolution, people that I would go into their classrooms, I'd just seen them in the protest. And, yesterday in Parliament, it was mentioned that we didn't used to know the political allegiance of our lecturers or our teachers, but now we do because they make it very clear, and that's why I think it's become so hostile. The support, I guess there is support, but I think the main issue is that the affiliations of these people, they're not just anti-Semitic. That's why they can grow so quickly. We've mentioned the anti-West, anti-democratic principles that they hold. That's why they're growing so much, especially, within the left. But, broadly, especially on campuses where this kind of like theory is so big, where we're like, everybody's anti-capitalism and everybody's anti-West because the West is colonial. Nearly everybody holds these values, so it's very easy to align with them and affiliate with the anti-Semites because the anti-Semites are also never only anti-Semitic, they are also anti-West and anti-democratic.